As a kid, I went through a lot. It really messed me up when my dad left my mom, and it made me feel really unsafe too. I don't know why, but I felt like something has been after me my whole life. No bullshit. I was strangely aware of death from a very young age, and it terrified me to even think of my family members dying. And I'd have terrible nightmares about awful things happening to my brother and my dad or my mom, starting at age 6 that I can remember. I've also had sleep paralysis my entire life, but didn't know what it was until a few years ago. I also realized that the stories I mentioned here weren't really sleep paralysis, but real encounters. I do have sleep paralysis on occasion, but it's nothing like what I describe here. So on one hand, I was scared to fall asleep because of my awful nightmares, but on the other hand, I was terrified of seeing the things I saw, and I still see them today. I had 2 windows in my room, one behind my bed and the other next to my bed. I kept my curtains open because the street light made me more comfortable falling asleep than the night light, as all of my night lights I had would mysteriously lose battery life after only a few days, and they'd flash randomly on and off throughout the night or day, or make clicking noises. I remember so clearly as it happened frequently from when I was about 7 to 12, when we moved out of that house, seeing a figure outside my window. A moving figure. Usually as dark as the night, and in some sort of robe. It looked a lot like the ghost of Christmas. And this same figure occurred in many of my nightmares as well. It usually just planted a hand on the window, or started banging on it, and continued to do so until I fell asleep. Other times I'd wake up in my, I'll call it sleep paralysis. But I genuinely saw the figure in the window, because it was always before I fell asleep, and it never woke me up in the middle of the night, so I know it wasn't just sleep paralysis, and I could move just fine. And a similar figure, dark but not robed, and usually donned in a white-brimmed hat, stood in the center of my room. He usually reached out to me, but other times he just stood there, watching, even though I couldn't see. Maybe he had eyes, maybe he didn't. That was when I was a child and lived in that house. That was pretty much all the creepy stuff that happened there. And yet, I didn't really believe in ghosts till I was 13. The problem is, I'm pretty sure that I'm the one that's haunted. My mom's apartment, after we moved from our previous house, which was new, and no one had died or anything like that, so it was very mysterious that I had these experiences at all, but it was old as hell. This apartment was originally built in 1920, and was only recently, barely restored. It has its problems, like leaky ceilings and bugs, but that's about it. But maybe the first time I experienced anything here was when I was about 13. My room was really messy in the farther half of my room, where my TV was set up. Very strangely, the 2 cats we had would not go past the front half of my room, toward the closet and TV. I was really curious about it, and one time we set my cat carefully in front of my TV, where she screeched. And that's not something she ever did. She sprinted out of my room. She was obsessed with me and mostly spent her time in my room, but only in the front half where my bed was. My mom even peeked in at her meowing at the TV one time when I was at my dad's. Then one night, I had gotten ready for bed and was about to lie down when I noticed a light coming from the other half of my room. My DVD player was on, and I hadn't used my TV or the DVD player in months. And it hadn't been on just 30 minutes prior, so what the hell happened? I knew damn well the cats wouldn't go near it, so I went to turn it off, and the DVD player has this little screen on it that says what it's doing, like searching or ejecting or turning off and stuff. But this time it said something that I've never seen before. Controls, it said. It turns out that you can click on the settings buttons of the DVD player and click a few more options to get to the screen where it would say that. But I didn't press those buttons, and neither did the cats, so I turned it off and strangely fell asleep just fine. Little things have happened in my mom's apartment since, but nothing that could be clearly described as a paranormal occurrence, until the last few years. I changed my room around in my mom's apartment when I was 16. I got a bigger bed and put in a wall for that, and that covered the first half of my room where the TV used to be, and put the TV in the front half of my room. The first thing I noticed was that my old Kinect, which sat on top of the TV, and it was a big box TV. I never used the Kinect, but it was connected to the Xbox and would turn on when I turned on the Xbox. I could see the little Kinect icon on my home screen and began noticing figures behind me, where my TV had been and now my bed was. But they didn't move. They were very humanoid and nothing in my room would make those shapes, let alone show up so prominently on my Kinect. Then came the touching. I began to feel someone touching me all the time. I would lie in bed and feel someone slowly press up against me. I'd be in my kitchen and suddenly feel someone touch my back or shoulder when no one was home. I could even be in school, standing behind my friends, and no one else behind me, and feel someone touch my shoulder. That's when I also realized it wasn't just happening at home. Not to mention my sleep paralysis began to get worse when I slept in my bed after I moved to the paranormal side of my room. But it changed from that figure to other things like spiders crawling all over me, or a human intruder breaking into my room through my window and reaching in their hand, and I could see it and hear it all happening, but no one was there. I can tell now that that was real sleep paralysis instead of my paranormal kinds, as they were brief and didn't feel threatening. My paranormal kind lasts for hours, at least it feels that way, and it's more ominous than threatening, even as a child. Then came the name calling. You know the feeling you get when someone says your name, but they didn't? Now imagine that happening when no one's there. Everywhere I went, school, my dad's house, my mom's house, someone calling my name, usually in my own voice or some man's, but the voice was never creepy. If it was my voice, it sounded like I was screaming my own name. But if it was that man's, it sounded almost loving or caring, and no one was there. But the footsteps creeped me out the most. The footsteps started when my brother left for college, and my mom and I were left in her apartment alone. The footsteps also still happen today. My mom works a shitty schedule at a nearby hospital and goes to bed around 7 p.m., only to wake up at 3:30 a.m. I used to go to bed around 10. My mom sleeps like shit. She always probably will too. So she wakes up in the middle of the night almost every night. One night when I was 16, I was lying in bed about to fall asleep when I heard pots and pans banging in the kitchen. I was tired, and I just assumed my mom couldn't sleep and got up to do the dishes or something. But then I heard footsteps outside my door and saw a shadow underneath. Kinda weird. My mom had zero reason to come near my door. But the next day, she got home from work. I asked her what she was doing the night before, and she said she slept great, and she didn't get up once. My mom didn't believe in ghosts, at least not spirits that would be around our small town or anything like that. It was something bigger, and a lot happened there. Many people died, and that was just one thing. But when my mom started hearing the footsteps at night, she started to realize the shit I've been saying might not be so crazy after all. She even started asking me if I'd gotten up at night when I usually slept great, and I didn't get up at all. Occasionally, we've heard the footsteps and have seen the shadow from underneath our doors together. Occasionally, we walk out just to see if we straight up have an intruder, just to see nothing there, but continue hearing the footsteps go around the house where we're looking. I've heard my mom's voice, as if she was talking to someone, when in reality she was fast asleep. I've seen things out of the corner of my eye all the time, regardless of where I am. Right before I left for college, I had sleep paralysis again, after not having it for a whole year. I was laying in my bed and there was a strange, bright light pointing toward the dark figure at the end of my bed with glowing red eyes and a wide-brimmed hat. But for some reason, this time I wasn't scared, not even nervous. I had an overwhelming sensation of relief. And the only thought in my normally loud and buzzing head was literally, "Thank God you're here, I missed you." I then fell asleep right after. I have no idea why I thought that. I hadn't seen this figure so clearly since the night I got my second COVID shot, which was about a year prior. I was terrified of it then. But this was the only time it had red eyes. I never saw these eyes before. Part of me thinks that this was a new ghost or something. And I have to admit, I've been longing for that sense of relief I had when I saw him there at the end of the bed. But part of me is just so damn curious and wonders if this is the same ghost. But has it had good intentions all along? Then I went to college and nothing happened for months until I came back after Thanksgiving break, deciding to drop out at the end of the semester. All of a sudden I'd be in my dorm room and see that pale creature out of the corner of my eye again. All of a sudden I'd feel touches when I was laying in my bunk. All of a sudden I'd hear that man's sweet voice calling my name out of nowhere, and nowhere to be found. Now I'm back home and my nightmares lately have been particularly bad. My nightmares since I was a kid have always had themes, I'm being chased or I'm being watched or something is hurting my family. But my nightmares over the past few months have changed into I'm alone, my family hates me, someone is after me. Not to mention a single nightmare where my family was possessed and the only safe place to hide from them was my room. This could have nothing to do with ghosts or anything, but I also think it's strange that the paranormal occurrences have been happening more often now that I'm back home. The footsteps are back, and I hear them almost every night. Last night, even my door cracked open the slightest bit when I was playing a game on my computer, and I see a pale creature all the time peeking around doorways or scampering at the end of my bed. Frequently, I felt someone laying beside me, but now instead of being worried, I feel comforted. While the pale figure still terrifies me, I genuinely miss that dark figure that I saw at the end of my bed. I wonder if that feeling that someone is laying next to me in my bed is the same spirit. I've tried talking to him. I say him because it's a rather overwhelmingly masculine presence that I feel. But without, actual ghost equipment, which may or may not even work. I can't get an actual answer. All I can say is that it doesn't seem that he can move things, but he can hear me. Maybe a few weeks ago, I was laying on my stomach when I felt someone slowly lay across my legs, kind of like a big dog. But my back stiffened, so right when I was about to roll over, I said, "I'm going to roll over now, but if you want to lay with me, you can after I move." And I rolled over and felt a whole body lay on top of me, to the point that I thought if I opened my eyes, I would see his face. I opened my eyes, but obviously no one was there. I even looked down at my legs, still feeling numb, and feeling the weight of someone on me, and no one was there. But it was comforting. I started calling him my ghostie since he seems to care about me. I've considered that this could be like a ploy of some sort of demon or something, but I don't feel drained. Now that I'm back home, I actually feel happier than I've been maybe my entire life, ghosts and all. I think I could have created an egregor, a spirit that manifests out of the mass feeling of sadness or depression, or something from trauma that I had when I was a kid. I was a very depressed little girl, and I remember contemplating offing myself when I was in first grade. But that wouldn't explain why I still have these experiences when I'm happy, and they're even stronger. And what are the pale creatures I see lurking around? I actually see those at my dad's house more often than here at my mom's, but I'll discuss what happened at my dad's place in another post. And why would I start being comforted by the same spirit that caused me so much fear and depression in the first place? I'd love to hear what everyone thinks of this. Am I haunted? Or am I just going to coincidentally haunted places. Why would I specifically be targeted? I Think I'm Haunted, Part 2. So when my grandfather on my dad's side built a house for his mother when he was in his 20s, she grew old and even died in the living room of that house. When she died, and after my dad left my mom, my dad bought it. He restored it, put in a pool, this and that. My room there was actually her old room before she died. I was 8 when my dad bought that house, so I had plenty of paranormal occurrences prior to living with my mom in her old house. My brother believes in ghosts, but he swears up and down that the only reason he believes, and the only time he's experienced anything paranormal, was in my dad's old house. He refuses, however, to tell us what happened to him while he lived there. Now, I mentioned my great-grandmother's passing, but I know she's not a ghost haunting me or that house. I didn't even know her. That and my spirits all feel very masculine in presence. If one of my ghosts, however, is a poltergeist, I probably acquired it from there. Not much happened at my dad's old house in the grand scheme of things. I lived there part-time, obviously because my parents divorced when I was 5. And for the longest time, out of any place I've lived, but from 8 to 16. But the few stories I had to tell about this place are significantly scarier to me than my ghosty that I've had at my mom's. Not to mention the shit I've seen at my dad's new place. Stuff moved around constantly. I'd set my toothbrush on the vanity counter just for it to suddenly be thrown off. Thrown. I'd see shadow figures stand in my doorway so often, the same one I usually saw in my paranormal kind of sleep paralysis at my mom's old house, and recently in her apartment, but this time I was wide awake at my dad's. That I had to start shutting my door before I went to bed. I'd hear shuffling from right outside my window, and even though I could see the moonlight coming through my closed curtains, I couldn't see the shadow where a person making those shuffling footsteps would be. I never had sleep paralysis there, strange nightmares, even considering how crazy my normal nightmares were, but no sleep paralysis ever occurred in that house. The whole energy was different in this house. I'm at my mom's old house. The atmosphere was lonely and empty, but there at my dad's, all I could feel was danger. That was the more normal kind of ghost stuff. A couple years before my dad sold that house, the second scariest thing that had ever happened to me in my life happened. Hell, it didn't even happen to me, but I heard it happen to someone or something else. I was laying in my bed one night, and I literally was just about to fall asleep when I hear a scream across the street. That house was on a street that ran through the middle of the woods, right? My great aunt lived next door to us, and across the street was an old couple who ran a very small maple syrup business. The next group of houses was much further down the street and separated by an assload of trees. This experience I had has led me to believe in paranormal creatures before I started seeing those pale guys crawling around. Before, I only believed in ghosts. So I heard this scream from across the street. I knew it wasn't the old man who lived across the street, as this absolutely blood-curdling scream sounded like a younger guy. There was only one guy that age that lived on my street, and that's much further down, and passed through loads of trees. Not to mention, this guy is very much alive today, and I graduated high school with him. So it's pretty clear that this scream came from no one I knew. And there weren't any missing people in the area, no suspicious things happening, nothing. No reason for me to hear what I did. So I rolled over and turned to my window, but the scream sounded far, like in the woods behind my old neighbor's house. And while I suppose that old couple could be murderers, I'd say it's highly unlikely as they're sweet as can be, and their lights were all out. It stopped, and thinking I might just be really tired, I rolled back over onto my back. Then the screaming started again. This time, much worse. If you can imagine someone torturing another person in front of you in the most horrible of ways, this is how that guy would sound. It was awful. It sounded an awful lot like when that one dude disappears in the Blair Witch Project, and you know he's dead, but the witch is impersonating his final screams as she killed him. Awful screams. It brings out the primal instinct to help. But I had this overwhelming feeling to stay right there in my bed for safety. It was only a year later that I learned about skinwalkers and how they can impersonate people to draw in their victims. I think this might be something like that. They also say that the farther away the scream is, the closer the creature is to you, which means that that thing could have been right outside my window after I rolled back over. I heard the scream one last time, the worst of it all, higher pitched, wordless, just moans, heavy breathing and screeching beyond terror. Then it suddenly stopped. And for some reason, I stopped worrying. As soon as the screaming stopped, I peacefully fell asleep. I seem to sleep best when some of the scariest shit happens to me right before, for some reason. I've never asked my family if they heard anything similar. At that house, I also heard my name whispered a lot, coming from right behind me. This time, I'm taking out my dogs. The parents left for work and my brother was in the shower. And as I opened the door, I heard someone whisper my name right behind me. Obviously, no one was there. I asked my brother if he had called me just in case, but he said no. And my name isn't exactly common, so I can't mistake Elena for the sound the door was making when I opened it. That's the only time I've heard a disembodied voice that didn't belong to me or that man that I hear all the time. Okay, now onto the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. My dad was in the process of selling the house, and I was 16. I was home alone and went to take the dogs out for a walk. Again, the property was big and bordered by a forest, with a tree line separating neighbors on one side of the house and my great aunt on the other side of the house, sharing a whole 2-acre wide lawn. The property was about 1.5 acres deep as well. So I normally just took the 3 little dogs up to the far tree line, then to the side tree line, and if they hadn't done their business yet, I'd take them up to the front yard. I hadn't even made it all the way down to the far tree line before they'd all done their business. And if they hadn't gotten out there, I don't know what I would have done. So I started to take them back to the house when I hear a rustling noise way over at the side of the tree line, about a full acre away from where I was standing with the pups. Sound traveled strangely far in my backyard, maybe because it was open before it was a tree line. I look over at the tree line, and I swear I'm shaking when I say this, because I've only told a precious few. I saw a tall, impossibly pale figure, wearing what looked like a dark gray suit and a matching top hat, walking very strangely into my back tree line. Because my mind couldn't comprehend what the fuck I was seeing in broad daylight, I'd first thought it was my neighbor from across the side tree line, but seeing the way it walked, looking closer at its skin, confirmed the worst. When I say impossibly white, I mean it was just about the color of paper. Its skin stood out so much against the gray of the suit. I was seeing it from the side at first, so I didn't really get a look at its face, but from what I could see, it didn't really look like it even had one. It was maybe 7 feet tall and went back and forth from hunching and straightening up as it walked. If you've played soccer, you'd know what high knees are. Now imagine walking very slowly doing high knees, taking one knee up to your chest, then the other, all the way up. That's how this thing walked. And from what I could see, there wasn't any hair on its head. Nothing but a drab top hat. And it walked this right next to my side of the tree line, looking and walking toward my far tree line. My dogs finally noticed that it was standing at the same place for a little bit too long, and looked over at this thing that I was seeing. Then one of my dogs started to bark, and I freaked the fuck out. It looked back up, expecting to see it start running at me, but I think it was much creepier that it continued to walk that same way toward the back tree line without looking over. All it did was slow down. Then my other dogs got in the barking. I just watched as it kept slowly walking toward my tree line. Who doesn't look in the direction of a dog barking, especially when it's really loud and echoing around the property? That's when I got this intense feeling of danger and grabbed all 3 pups and sprinted back to the house. Right when I was opening the back door, I looked back, and I could barely see it still, but it was now standing at the edge of the tree line, its legs hidden by the brush, but its top hat and torso clearly visible. I locked all the doors, windows, closed all the curtains, turned off the lights, and cried on the couch with my dogs in my arms until my brother got home. I told him about it, and he was genuinely confused because he didn't believe me, but he saw how scared I was, so he insisted it was a white-tailed deer or something. He made fun of me for thinking I had seen Slender Man, even though I insisted that this thing wasn't lanky and it wore a top hat. I had even called him when he was on his way, telling him to be careful and to pull into the garage rather than stop in the driveway and walk outside to the front door. My dad bought a new house. I guess I mean property, because it was barely even built when he bought it, intending it to be a camp 30 minutes away from his old house. It had no insulation, barely running water, no floor, blah 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 blah. Dad and I built it up from that, added an enclosed porch overlooking a brook, and built my room before we had it restored. That place always gave me the creeps. It was a lot like the feeling of the previous house, danger, but when it was restored, it felt great. I liked to go for walks down our driveway, which, by the way, is a half a mile one way and a mile long back the other way. It's really in the woods. The closest neighbors are a 7-minute drive away, so it was soothing to go for a walk down a nice dirt road surrounded by nature. But then I started getting that feeling again. I started seeing things in the trees. I couldn't make them out. On one walk, I could have sworn I saw the figure in the top hat, faceless and now staring at me, standing deep in the woods. Several times I somewhat thought I saw it, but this time I was nearly convinced. So I ran back to my house and swear I could hear it running after me. But when I turned around at the clearing with my house, there was nothing there. But since I'm not completely convinced that I even saw it or heard the footsteps, I'm not entirely sure that that was even the figure. Not to mention, I was 30 minutes away from my old house. This is when I started seeing those little pale fuckers out of the corner of my eye. I only saw them inside, and usually when it was dark. It all started at my dad's new house, but they seemed to follow me everywhere. The first time I saw one, I was going to the bathroom right before bed. It was pitch black out, and I left the door open since I was the only person sleeping downstairs, and my dad and his girlfriend were passed out upstairs. Since the door was open, I was looking directly into the kitchen, where we have a big marble island in the middle of it. I saw these long, pale fingers with its claws slowly reaching around the corner of the island. But only if I looked over there, out of the corner of my eye. I have very strange peripheral vision, and I can see very clearly using it. So I could see those fingers very clearly. So then I started straight at the island, hoping not to see the fingers again, but eventually, even now, I was looking straight at it and not using my peripheral vision. I saw a face emerge from around the corner, close to the floor. It looked eerily like a drawing I made as a kid, but I don't remember seeing this thing prior to this moment. It was white, much like the top hat dude, but with dark splotches all over it. It had dark sunken holes for eyes, but I'm not exactly sure even if they were eyes at all. And for a mouth, much like this drawing I had made, it didn't really have a mouth but a hole, but a thin line of crusted and dripping goo in the form of a grin along its face, no hair. Yeah, Imagine seeing that shit in the dark. Unpleasant. But then it just sort of faded out of existence as I was looking at it. It didn't disappear slowly, but it faded away from my sight. So I got the fuck out and laid in bed terrified it would come back. Couldn't see it in my room though. I never have. Not there at least. But then almost every night after that, I saw the same thing. Sometimes it crawled really fast past the bathroom doorway. I could see it move so clearly in the corner of my eye. It wasn't built like a human. It walked on all fours, but instead of an arched back like a human would have, its back was flat, and its legs were long and skinny and built like a fucked up dog, except for the arms which were short with those long clawed fingernails. And I still see this thing. I've gotten so freaking used to it, I'm not even scared anymore, just weirded out and wondering if I'm crazy. A couple days ago, here at my mom's apartment, I saw it on the floor beside my bed. But when I turned to look at it once more, it scampered away. But it sounded like something was clawing at my rug all night long, kind of like a cat. Both of my cats are dead, and they never play with the rug. So this weird thing was playing at the foot of my bed with my rug. So yeah. I think I'm haunted. Even though the poltergeist activity only happened at my dad's old house, I've seen one thing move in my room here at my mom's one time. I had my slippers at the end of my dresser. One night, I walked into my room and one of my slippers had somehow gotten slurped up underneath my dresser. So I pulled it out from under, wipe it off, and leave my room again when I hear it slide again. Once more. This was recent, and since I'm so fucking used to ghosts, this only annoyed me rather than scared me. Like, come on, my slippers, do better. But then I turn around and sure enough, the same slipper was completely underneath my dresser again. It's never happened since. Nothing has moved around me since. But I'm curious that the spirit from my dad's, which didn't feel malevolent, followed me here after all these years, but why? And even more creepily, although I'm the happiest I've ever been right now, the haunting seems to be the worst. Only the feeling of the ghost's presence isn't scary anymore. It's almost relaxing to know that they're there, and I don't know why it suddenly changed. But the weird thing is that I'm constantly waking up with scratch marks on my wrists, arms, and hands. Scratches that range from size of my thumb to about the size of my fingernail. I sleep with my arms tucked into my chest and I have long fingernails, but this has never happened before. If anybody knows what this means, I'd really appreciate some help. I could just be paranoid, especially after writing this. I'm a little nervous to deal with my ghosts and everything else I've experienced. I have a tiny scratch at the base of my thumb right now, actually. Shadow Man upstairs. When I was a kid, I'd stay over at my grandfather's house every other day while my mom was out doing stuff. Normally, I didn't feel scared of his house, unless it was real late at night. But something happened in the morning when I was about 4 years old. This particular morning, my aunt, who was staying upstairs for a long period of time, had left the house before either me or my grandfather had woke up. Later, my grandfather, assuming she was still upstairs, had left to run some errands. I would sleep in the same bed as him, so when I woke up, I noticed he wasn't in his bed and called out to him. After a few minutes, I began to panic, and I got out of bed to run upstairs to see if my aunt was there. And that's when I saw it. A tall, pitch-black figure standing directly in front of my door, which was closed. There were literally no features on this figure, and it stood completely motionless. My best description is that it looked like a three-dimensional humanoid shadow. I began to creep towards it, but when I got close to it, I decided to go back downstairs, still panicking with tears in my eyes. I wasn't scared of the shadow, but I guess my human nature kicked in and told me not to get within arm's length of something I didn't understand. My mother, discovering I was alone from talking to both my aunt and grandfather, sped over to his house as quickly as possible to pick me up. I was more afraid that I'd get in trouble for pissing the bed than I was for the shadow man upstairs being there. When I changed my clothes and got into the car, my mom asked me, "Did you try to go upstairs and see if your auntie was there?" To which I replied, "I tried, but the man was standing in front of the door." Keep in mind, this is coming from a 4-year-old who barely has a grasp on the concept of lying. Imagine hearing that from your kid randomly, of all things. I'm an adult now, and I've heard this from my mother. And when she was younger, she was staying over at my grandfather's house, and one night she woke up and saw 2 men talking in the hallway, but couldn't make out what they were actually saying. When she screamed to wake her dad up, turned back toward the hallway, they were gone. My grandfather's house is pretty old, so between these 2 experiences, I think there's at least one spirit haunting this house. I haven't really experienced any more paranormal stuff other than seeing a shadow of what looked like my dog running to the side of my bed. My buddy saw it too. But I never forget the tall, featureless figure. The most haunting paranormal experience of my life. This happened to me in my early teens. I'm 21 now. My best friend growing up had this huge farmhouse in the middle of Virginia, and it was very old, but beautiful, and also had a very dark history. In this house, there's a tunnel that leads to an underground room of sorts that was used for slaves to hide in the 1800s. And I'm 90% sure that some died down there while hiding, so you can imagine the history and energy that fills this house. I always felt scared there. I never felt alone, and I wouldn't go anywhere alone in the house, even to just grab something out of my room, the room I was staying in. Even the family was scared to stay there with no company, because the intense apparitions and experiences, which I can get into another day. The rooms were massive, and the entire house was white, with honestly creepy vintage decor. There was even a cabinet of fucking ventriloquist dolls upstairs. No joke. It was a really odd family house with lots of dark problems. Anyways, the second time I visited that house, I was with my mom, my best friend at the time, and her mom. It was a girls' trip, and one night I woke up, and I was so thirsty, and the last thing I wanted to do was to go downstairs and get water. I was terrified, and I hated that house, especially at night, but my mom was dead asleep, so I literally sprinted downstairs with my head only looking at the floor. I made my water in 5 seconds, and when I made it to the stairs, something compelled me to look at the giant glass door that were in front of the stairs. I was horrified, but felt like I needed to look out the window. What I saw when I looked out that window will haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw a man as real as anything I've ever seen. It was pitch black outside, with a huge bright moon. The man was all black, like a silhouette, but because of the moon being so bright, I could clearly see his entire body. He was blacker than black, and he stood out so much I 100% thought he was a trespasser. He was wearing a top hat and was unhumanly tall, like 7 feet. My heart literally felt like it stopped beating. I felt like I was in a trance. I was so unexplainably horrified, but I couldn't look away. He was moving a little bit, almost like breathing. Then about 10 seconds later, he's gone, disappearing into thin air. I fucking panicked and bolted upstairs after I snapped out of my trance. I cried to my mom and I was up all night. The next morning I told my friend and her mom about the experience, and they weren't shocked at all, as they had seen multiple full-bodied apparitions in the house themselves. The nanny that worked for them even refused to go into some rooms of the house. I never went back after that. Heartbeats. I'm a 10th grader, and right now, I'm having my board exams. For those who don't know, it's a first set of public exams we face as students in India. I've always had a habit of studying at night, as I'm mentally much more comfortable with the silence. As a result, I can really concentrate. This sometimes proves as a curse, but 99 times out of 100, it's a boon in disguise. I should make it clear that I've lived in a rented house, a very common thing in India, all of my life. I shifted cities 3 years back, and I've never felt any kind of presence anywhere near me, and to be frank, I'm grateful for that. I'm very much a scaredy cat, and I'm a fan of English literature in general, irrespective of the author. However, I still enjoy following up on spooky details here and there. That's just a backstory. So last night I was solving papers on math. The next paper is math, so wish me luck. It's my favorite subject too. And I was pondering over a sum. I would take a guess that it was around 2:30 or 3-ish. I tend to switch off the fan in my room when I do math, because I feel even the sound of the fan can be a distraction when I'm trying to concentrate. You get the idea. I like it deathly quiet to the extent that I can hear my own breath. Naturally, everybody in my house was asleep. My parents' room is just adjacent to mine, and I could hear their soft breath in the quiet of the night. However, the abnormal thing was, it followed my heartbeat. Distinct sound of a healthy heart beating right behind me. I dropped my pen from shock. It felt like it was right next to my ears, and it was shockingly loud. We're a nuclear family of 3 living in a rented apartment in suburban Mumbai. In all the 3 years I've lived here, I've only experienced positive vibes in the environment. This felt different. It felt like whatever it was not here to do any harm, neither was it here to do any good. However, it lasted about 5 seconds. I usually keep the small balcony in my room open for a cool breeze blowing in, but at this point, I noticed even that had stopped. I was sweating profusely and I was scared out of my wits, so I resorted to the idea of snuggling up to my mother for the night. I'd had enough. I tossed and turned all throughout the night. My parents, however, didn't believe me when I told them about what was in my room. They just brushed it off as an overactive imagination, with an alternative of me being extremely sleepy, perhaps. To make it crystal clear, I never do math when I'm sleepy, so I wasn't. Posting it here, hoping that my fellow Redditors will maybe believe me and offer any possible logical explanations for, what maybe we can find or might know of. Laughably obvious sign from recently deceased father. It is with a heavy heart that I recount the events that occurred a mere 2 weeks ago, which changed the course of my life forever. My beloved father passed away suddenly, leaving me and my mother devastated beyond measure. We were both in the throes of unimaginable grief, struggling to cope with the sudden void in our lives. One morning after my father had left this world, my mother and I were making the bed in my parents' room. As we were talking, my mother began to have a strange meltdown and overcame with sheer weight of her emotions. In the midst of her distress, we left the room briefly to retrieve something, but upon returning, we were greeted by a sight that defied all explanation. There, sitting on the bed, were 2 Tylenol PM capsules, visibly moving from side to side, completely unaided. Nobody had touched the bed, and the windows were tightly shut, precluding any possibility of a gust of wind causing the capsules to move. It was inexplicable, and we were left stunned and bewildered. But then it hit us. This was undoubtedly a message from my father. He was communicating with us, telling us that he was right there with us, watching over us, and trying to provide us with some solace. It was a comforting thought, and we were both overwhelmed with emotions. It was as though my father was telling my mother to take 2 capsules to help her sleep, knowing that it was something that she often relied on to help her relax. It was a poignant and powerful reminder that my father's love transcended the boundaries of life and death, and that he would always be with us, watching over us and guiding us through life's challenges. It was a moment of profound connection, and it gave us both a sense of peace and reassurance that'll stay with us for the rest of our lives. I communicated with my deceased father. When I was just a 7-year-old child, my father passed away tragically in a car accident. I was so young and didn't understand how to deal with the sudden loss. Being raised in a Catholic household, I thought prayer was the answer. I prayed for him to show me a sign that he was still around and not just gone forever. At the time, I regretted praying, but in hindsight, I'm grateful for the experience. For a year after his passing, I had numerous encounters with my father's spirit. The first time it happened, I woke up in the middle of the night to see him standing next to my bed. I heard the creaking of the door and then the sound of his heavy boots as he walked toward me. I was terrified and squeezed my blankets while sweating profusely. I lay there facing the wall, too afraid to move until he left. On several other occasions, I was awoken by coins being bounced off of my bureau. There were times when objects were gently being moved off the top of it. I had various dreams where he visited me. One night, I felt a poke on my foot or my leg, and I became so scared that I decided to pray and ask him to stop. Thankfully, all these encounters stopped when I asked him to, and I was relieved to know that he was still watching over me. As time went by, I also had some experiences with a medium, which reinforced my belief that he's still with me. I could sense his presence and feel his love and protection. These encounters gave me comfort and a sense of peace, knowing that my father's still around, watching over me and my family. Although his passing was heartbreaking and difficult to accept, I'm grateful for the experiences, and they've helped me realize that he's still with us. I cherish the memories of my father, and I believe that he's always with me in spirit, guiding me through life. Ghost woman behind me. When I was a young child, my family would take trips to visit my mother's side of the family in town, and it was about a 7-hour drive away. My aunt's houses were known for being haunted, and strange things would always happen, with ghosts frequently being seen. On this particular occasion, my aunt was living on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town. It was during this visit that my maternal grandmother passed away, and we went to stay at my aunt's house to visit and later attend the funeral. On the first night of our stay, my older brother and cousins stayed up in the kitchen cooking and talking. My parents and I were in the far bedroom down the hall from the kitchen, with me watching television while my parents were falling asleep. Suddenly, my brother called me into the kitchen and asked me if I wanted corn on the cob. I declined, but he asked me to ask my mother if she wanted one. I walked back into the bedroom and asked my mother if she wanted corn on the cob, to which she replied no. I then returned to the hallway to tell my brother that my mom didn't want corn on the cob, but he just stared at me with huge eyes, wide open, looking petrified. It wasn't until the next day when my brother and I drove into town to get something to eat that he revealed to me what had happened the previous night. He had seen a woman standing behind me, and he had assumed it was my mother at first, but the woman had just vanished into thin air. My brother had been too scared to tell me the previous night as he didn't want to frighten me. The incident was so unnerving that we ended up getting a hotel room for the next night and didn't stay at my aunt's house ever again. My brother was still too spooked. However, this wasn't my first encounter with the paranormal. I had experienced many other instances of unexplained phenomena in my own childhood home. Did I hear a ghost? So this just happened not more than an hour ago, so I'm going to write this out while it's still fresh. About 3 weeks and 1 day ago, there was a suicide at my uni campus. Apparently they had jumped from the top floor to the basement area, a lower part of the building that's open air. Now I had already woken up that day feeling dread in the air. Ever since I was little, I felt as if I was connected to spirits or ghosts more than others, but I digress. That's a story for another time. Anyways, last night, or the past 3 hours or so, I decided that I'd take some pics at campus when it was dark out, but I'm not sure why. But I couldn't and still can't sleep, so I figured might as well go take some creepy or luminal pics. So I went out and took the pictures. Then I decided to go to this building where the incident happened. As soon as I went down the stairs to the lower area, I immediately felt unsafe, and as if I was being watched. Something definitely felt off, so I tried to take some quick shots and just get out. I took about 4 pictures on the leftmost side of the area, then moved to the center part. As soon as I raised my phone to take the picture, I hear something behind me which sounded like a rustling or a small crack. I pause and try to filter the sound out by just not acknowledging it. Not 1 second later, I hear a tremendous and loud crunch from my left right behind me. I've never been so frozen in fear in my life. I don't even think, and I just start walking to the right side as the stairs were there. I quickly ran up those stairs, then looked back, debating with myself if I should check or not. I decided to briefly investigate, so I went near there and thought the sound came from. Peered over the railing but saw nothing. I'm back in my dark room, and I'm out of morbid curiosity. I researched what a body sounds like when it hits the ground, and lo and behold, a loud, crunching, popping sound. So yeah, I'm not getting any sleep tonight, and I'll definitely never go back anywhere near that building. What do y'all think it was? In about 4th or 5th grade, my friend and I, who I'm going to call Jade, were obsessed with ghost stories and anything paranormal. For months and years on end, we would try to contact the dead every time we hung out, despite our parents forbidding it. There are a few instances which I still remember so vividly when I think about them when I'm alone. I still feel uneasy feelings. Jade and I tried for weeks to get someone or something to show themselves. One night, we stayed up late to do this, and we ended up being successful. We turned the lights off, and we had a few candles lit, so we were still able to see each other. We made a circle out of socks and sat in the middle of it with bowls of salt for protection. We asked and asked for something to show itself. Jade had many posters on her walls, and that's how it chose to show itself. There's a poster with dogs on it behind us, and whatever it was in the room slapped the poster on the wall so hard. It was like if you had a normal piece of paper and you slapped it from the air down onto a table. That sound is so distinct, and we freaked out, especially when her parents came in and told us not to bang on the walls, and we tried to tell them it wasn't us, and they didn't believe us at all. We ended up not sleeping in her room that night, and not long after that incident, Jane had a phobia of any of her stuffed animals looking at her while she slept, so she would always face them toward the wall before bed, and this one teddy bear would always be turning back, watching her after that. At my house, when there was probably a year straight where I would hear activity in my room, when I was about 11 or 12, I would try to fall back asleep at night, and the sound of whispering would keep me up. It was like whispering voices all layered on top of each other, and it was so overwhelming. I could hear my toys move in the middle of the night, but was never brave enough to peek my head out and see from under the covers. I had always sleepwalked and still do, but during this year, my sleepwalking was at an all-time high, and my parents would find me in random places in the house talking to myself in the middle of the night. There was one night which especially haunted me to this day. I had the flu when I was 13 or 14, and I was really sick, and I had problems sleeping. I always slept with the nightlight on, so my room was dim and shadowy. I laid there on my back with my eyes open, unable to fall asleep. That layered whispering stuff started again for the first time in years, along with whispering. These huge shadows on the walls of my room slowly creeped up. I remember laying there, sweating, unable to move because I was terrified. They slowly moved up the walls for about a minute until they reached my ceiling and caved in on top of me, pitch black. It was suffocating and debilitating, and I still freak out thinking about it. The visuals are still so clear in my head. Anybody can explain this as a fever dream, but I swear I did not fall asleep. I could not fall asleep. I believe I had an outer-body experience because I saw this from the position of the corner of my room. I don't know how to explain this, but I know in my heart I was not asleep. Why does paranormal activity often happen to children rather than adults? Why do ghosts and poltergeists or whatever target kids? Why have I not experienced anything like this since I was a teenager? Dead grandpa came to meet his beloved. When my grandma was nearing the end of her life, I made the decision to stay with her at her home to watch over her in her final days. During my stay, I encountered a series of unexplainable occurrences that I believe were caused by my grandpa's ghost, who was waiting to meet her at the gates in the afterlife. It's important to note that my grandma's house had shag carpets, which meant that it would take some force to open or close one of the inside doors. The doors were not easily moved by a breeze or any other natural occurrence. A few days before her passing, I was hanging out in the basement when the bathroom door suddenly swung open on its own. Frightened, I spoke out loud, addressing my grandpa's ghost, saying, "Grandpa, if that's you, please don't spook me. I'm afraid of ghosts." I wasn't sure what to make of this strange occurrence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow related to my grandpa. The day before my grandma passed away, she was confined to her bed, and I closed the bedroom door to keep any noise from waking her up while I did some chores around the house. I only left it closed for a few minutes, but when I went back to check on her, I found that the door had mysteriously opened on its own. I closed it again and went about my business, but when I checked in on her once more, the door had opened again. During one of her last days, my grandma spoke about seeing family members who had passed before her, including my grandpa. I couldn't help but feeling that the moving doors were caused by my grandpa, eagerly waiting for his beloved wife to join him in the afterlife. These strange and unexplainable occurrences left me feeling both bewildered and comforted. While the idea of ghosts and the paranormal had always frightened me, I found solace in the thought that my grandpa was watching over my grandma in her final days. And that was what he was waiting to welcome her for, to welcome her into the afterlife with open arms. Glitch in the Matrix? Time reversed. The story I'm about to tell you is one that still baffles me to this day, even though it happened 16 years ago. It was a typical day. My friend and I were sitting on my brother's bed, just watching TV and chatting. My brother had a box of metal BB pallets on the bed, but we didn't bother moving it because we had his stuff everywhere. Suddenly, my big green German Shepherd Guinness came running into the room, playfully jumping up onto the bed. As he did, the box of BB pellets flipped over, and the pellets scattered everywhere, the sound of them hitting the hardwood floor still ringing in the ears. But then something inexplicable happened. It was as if time itself reversed, and Guinness ends up back on the floor, as if he had jumped down backwards, and all the PB pellets reversed back into the box. Even Guinness had a look of confusion on his face, and he ran out of the room. When my friend and I looked down, there were absolutely no pellets on the ground, and the box was closed and secure on the bed. At first, we thought we were imagining things, but when we talked about it later, we both remembered the incident in vivid detail. We were only around 13 years old at the time, but the memory of what we witnessed has stayed with us for all these years. It's a strange and unexplainable phenomenon that I still can't wrap my head around. Series of weird recent events and their possible explanations. I want to start off that I'm not on any mind-altering or hallucinogenic drugs, nor have I ever been diagnosed with any type of psychosis or other mental illness. The first thing happened around Christmas Eve, and around 6 a.m., and I had this feeling of multiple hands, or maybe just one hand, wrapping around my neck and trying to pull me out of bed. It stopped, then happened again, as it was a person trying again after the first attempt failed. My first thought was a break-in, maybe due to how realistic it felt. But when the sun finally came up and there was no sign of forced entry or broken door, locks, or windows, as if nothing had even happened at night. This one was most likely sleep paralysis, and I wrote it off as such, as I've heard stories that are very similar, and it's a common thing. The second instance was last month or so, in which I briefly felt the touch around the same area, this time on my arm or shoulder. I just remember the touch being super cold and icy, and it happened around 2 a.m. This one was possibly a tactile hallucination, though I never heard of the sensation of feeling cold. It's not impossible, just unusual maybe. Now this third event is where it gets weird. Around 5 a.m. I was jarred by the weirdest sound. It sounded exactly like a screaming horse, and it was right outside my door. I live in a residential area with no farm animals. It also sounded like whatever was making the horse's noise was also trying to open my door by rattling and pulling the handle. The sounds are way too clear to be an auditory hallucination. I've had those before, and those can be loud but usually only heard within my headspace. This was very clearly happening. It also wasn't a dream either, because I was more than half awake at the time, as I recently went back to bed after using the bathroom. The first two I have possible rational explanations for, but the horse noise incident I have no idea about. Does anyone here know what could be going on with that?